Hello, and welcome to Around the Political World with John Rothman. I am your host, John Rothman. If you're a fan of the show, make sure to hit the follow button on the top right of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening at this very moment. When you hit follow, leave a review or share an episode with a friend. It helps other people discover the show, keeps us going, and as I like to remind you each and every day, it expands our base. I want to divide this podcast into two parts. First, the proposal that is floating around the White House that Joe Biden is going to propose fundamental changes in the United States Supreme Court. This is not the first time that a Democratic president has made such an astounding application of what he wants. Franklin D. Roosevelt did it in 1937 with the court packing plan, which was defeated in the end because conservative Democrats and Republicans united against the idea of expanding the Supreme Court. And of course, in the end, nature took its course. And by the time Franklin Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, the Supreme Court had been remade in his image. Only one justice remained who had not been nominated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, what is the concern that we now hear, primarily from some Democrats who are concerned about the Supreme Court? The first concern is term limits. They believe that the Supreme Court justices should be term limited. Let me make my position clear. I'm opposed to term limits for Supreme Court justices. The whole point was to relieve justices of the Supreme Court of any sense of political pressure. I believe that to be a very honorable and reasonable assumption. Number two, they want to make sure that the Supreme Court overturns the presidential immunity decision, among others. Well, in order to do that, you have to have new justices on the court when there are vacancies. And that leads me to the conclusion that all of you already know, that who is president matters. If we want a more conservative court, we should vote Republican. If we want a more liberal court, we need to vote for the Democrats. And number three, and this to me is one of the most compelling arguments about the United States Supreme Court, would be an ethics rule that would apply to justices on the Supreme Court. Now, you understand that, and I've talked about it before, that each institution in the federal government, the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and indeed the executive branch, set up certain rules by which they are governed. I don't think it is a good idea for there to be an ethics rule imposed by a constitutional amendment or by fiat. I think that's something the Supreme Court has to come up with, and it ought to be a public document which everyone can see and read and which all the justices subscribe to. In short, I believe that if President Biden decides to move to create a new set of rules for the Supreme Court, both through constitutional amendment and statute, it's a losing proposition. That's just my opinion. I think we have to understand that the intent in adding justices to the United States Supreme Court, which is the last component of this particular proposal, may work to the advantage of the Democrats in the short term. But if the Republicans are in the White House and nominees for the Supreme Court are nominated by Republican presidents, well, the margin on the Supreme Court would be even greater. No, leave it at 9 and let history be the judge and the voters be the judge. To tamper with the Supreme Court would, I think, be a supreme folly. The next thing I want to deal with quickly is the Republican National Convention. Tonight, Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance will speak to the convention. The eyes of Republicans and Americans will be on J.D. Vance. We don't really know him. And so this will be his chance to make his statement. I always remember Sarah Palin's great speech to the Republican National Convention in 2008. It was a way of introducing herself to the American people. J.D. Vance is going to do the same thing tonight. And by the way, that applies to anybody who is nominated for national office the first time they appear before a convention. But there's more, because tonight is the night of the Republican convention when they will be dealing with national security issues. And this is important. Remember, traditional Republicans, the Ronald Reagan Republicans, felt that there was an obligation to participate in the world. Certainly, Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and certainly the leaders of the Republican Party in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s, believed in America's role in the world. Well, we now know that J.D. Vance opposes continued aid for Ukraine, this at a critical moment, when the fate of Ukraine may hang in the balance. We know that our European allies are tremendously concerned about the future of NATO. And we also understand that who is president matters. So tonight, the Republican Party will have to define itself when it comes to foreign policy. Will it be a party that is interventionist, or will it be a party that returns to Republican roots of isolationism? That's going to be the question. And J.D. Vance is the symbol of that future. I expect tonight's discussion on national security and the question of America's role in the world to be one of the most interesting debates, discussions, and, well, statements of fact that the Republican Party will offer us during this convention. So let me tell you, we have to keep our eye on several different balls at the same time. I have not mentioned the new polls that indicate that Joe Biden is a certain loser. We'll be dealing with that in a subsequent podcast. But in the meantime, let's think about what Joe Biden is proposing on the Supreme Court. Let's think about what the Republicans will talk about when it comes to foreign policy. And let's proceed as we approach tonight the speech by J.D. Vance, and tomorrow night, the acceptance speech by Donald J. Trump. Thank you for tuning into another episode of Around the Political World with John Rothman. Make sure to follow along and let me know your thoughts on the show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and sharing an episode with a friend or colleague so we can continue to grow and expand. Of course, that is our goal. And I also want to indicate that you can interact with me on Facebook and on LinkedIn. Special appreciation to Gogo Zoger, who is the producer of Around the Political World with John Rothman. We will be hearing more in the days ahead. And the place to go, I believe, is right here on Around the Political World with John Rothman. See you tomorrow.